Hi everyone, welcome back. This guide has 5 parts. Today is the second tutorial, how to handle multiple permissions using new API. Android Jetpack introduced the new contract-based API. This API makes it easier to work with requesting runtime permissions. Let's see the background. If your app is installed below Android 6, the permissions are automatically granted by simply declaring them. But on Android 6 or above, if you declare any dangerous permissions, you must request them at runtime. So, dangerous permissions is called runtime permissions. Each of the Google, whether any permission is dangerous or not. This is documented at the URL below. We will see two kinds of methods to request runtime permissions, old and new. Before the new API, usually we used to use request code to request runtime permission. To use old API, first request permission with request code using request permissions function, and then process the result with the request code using onRequestPermissions result function. But Android Jetpack introduced a new Activity Result API. It's a contract-based API. It makes the runtime permission easier to handle because this API allows the system to manage the permission request code. To use new one, first, register the contract for processing the result of a permission request using register for activity result function, and then launch the contract. Let's take a look at how each API is used. Let's start with the old one. Step 1. The check self permission determines whether you have been granted a particular permission. It's a common API. Second step, we request permissions by passing request code to request permissions function. In the next step, request code will be used for identification while processing the result of a permission request. Third step, after the user responds to the system permissions dialog, the system then invokes onRequestPermissions result function. We need to check request code in onRequestPermissions result function to identify what permission is requested, and then the desired processing is performed depending on each result. For example, re-requesting or notifying functional restrictions. Now, let's take a look at the usage of the new API. Step 1. Preparation. Allow the system to manage the permission request code. To do this, add dependencies in the module's build.gradle file. For your activity, declare dependencies like this. For your fragment, declare dependencies like this. Step 2. Requesting. To request multiple permissions at a time using new Activity Result API, we need to register request multiple permissions contract using register for activity result function. It's recommended to put contract logic in activity or fragment initialization logic part. In case of requesting only single permission, you can use request permission contract. Sample app running is like this. In this tutorial, we will use the new API to build a sample app. We use view binding. Add build features section to module build.gradle and enter view binding equals true. This simplifies the code as we can use a UI component directly without the find view by ID function. We use a new API. Enter Android KTX in the dependencies section of build.gradle. Android KTX is a set of Kotlin extensions that are included with Android Jetpack and other Android libraries. Through this, allow the system to manage the permission request code. UI writing. Create a launch button for requesting multiple runtime permissions. Next, write a text to display when the user denied a permission. This is code for using view binding. If view binding is enabled for a module, a binding class is generated for each XML layout file that the module contains. Each binding class contains references to the root view and all views that have an ID. The name of the binding class is generated by converting the name of the XML file to Pascal case and adding the word binding to the end. With Pascal case, the first letter of every word in the ID is uppercase. For example, the generated binding class of ActivityMain.xml is ActivityMainBinding. It's as follows to use view binding in activities. Please refer to the link for the usage of view binding in fragments below. Declare a string array for multiple runtime permissions. The sample app uses 3 runtime permissions. Use the new API register for activity result function to register a contract for requesting permissions. Since we need to request multiple permissions at a time, we register the request multiple permissions contract. If you want to request only one permission, you should register a request permission contract. Later, when the contract is launched and the user responds to the system permissions dialog, the result is returned to the callback function. The result value, permissions, contains whether each request permission is granted or not. In the callback function logic, the result value is logged, and the restrictions are displayed as a snack bar if there are refused permissions. Enter the logic for the button. When the button is clicked, launch the contract. It's the first request for permission. A total of 3 system permissions dialogs appear. Among them, the read context permission request is refused for testing. Looking at the log, you can see read context was refused. According to Android's permission request processing policy, refused permissions can be requested once more. Let's request permission once more. Only one system permissions dialog appears. This is for the previously unapproved read context permission. Let's refuse this request again. Looking at the log, read context was refused. From now on, even if you request the permission, the system permissions dialog will not appear. However, only the same result is generated. Looking at the log, read context was refused. Let's summarize this tutorial. Before the new API, usually we used to use request code to request runtime permissions. But Android Jetpack introduced a new Activity Result API. It's a contract-based API, making the runtime permission easier to handle. Because this API allows the system to manage the permission request code. Please refer to the source code links for each API below. If you found this content useful, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you in the next tutorial, how to save shareable media file.